So tonight we have a special event in honor of Women's History Month. And if you have an opportunity to go downstairs, you will see some fine patriotic women on posters from World War II that are on display for the whole month. It's a series of beautifully done artistic posters that Marilyn Sansone is letting us borrow for the month of March. So please take a look at that. And you will find out about the women in Madison County who contributed to the war effort in World War II this time. So please welcome Matt Urtz.
If you've never seen Vince Doty perform, it's spectacular. He took part in our Freedom Walk this fall as Garrett Smith, and it was wonderful. So this talk came about, shameless plug time, a research project. I published a book called Honoring World War Casualties in Madison County, which deals with soldiers that were killed in action during the two world wars. If you want to buy a copy, it's $24 after the talk is over. All proceeds benefit our war memorial in Wamsville. So, this came out of that research. It started with that, and then I thought it might be interesting to look into the role that women played, both in Madison County and abroad. And then it really took off this past fall when I was at a veterans event, and a veteran walked up to me and said, "Hey, do you know about that lady that flew a plane?" And I said, "You're going to have to be a little more specific than that." And he said, "She's from Chittenango." Still kind of on the rocks here. And it turns out there was a woman from Chittenango who flied a plane. And at the end of this talk, I will play you some of her interviews that she did talking about her experiences. And then from there, I wanted to look at how the role of women changed, because obviously World War I was the spawn, in some ways, of the modern women's rights movement, in that women had opportunities for the first time that they did not have in many other cases. And that starts with kind of the women's role prior to the war. So, women's workforce, just some random spots. Steel workers, less than 10% of the steel workers in the United States were women. Less than 10% of the automobile industry. You get up to textiles mills, clothing factories, were a little above 40%, and retail apparel. So if you're selling clothes, there is a 75% chance you're a woman working in that market. And that was where women worked. Only about 15% of married women worked outside of their home. Only about 28% of single women worked outside of their home. That's significantly different numbers than today. Women as a whole made up only about 27% of the workforce in 1940. And at that point in time, women had never been allowed to serve in the military. Now there has to be a classification to that. Women were allowed to serve in the Navy very briefly during World War I. In the Civil War, they could join certain corps, so they could be part of the Nurses Corps, but that was not considered part of the military at that point in time. Technically, women would not be allowed to serve in the Army or the Armed Forces until 1948, but they had opportunities that were never available prior to that point during this war. They wouldn't be allowed to enter service academy until the 1970s. And one of the great stories with that is there is a gentleman from Hamilton who was the person who had to make the argument why women shouldn't be allowed in service academies. And he's a wonderful person to talk to because he didn't really want to do that, but that was his job. So he went and he made an argument about why they shouldn't be. And it's really interesting to hear him talk about it. Not really nice, but there's reasons. They were not allowed to fly combat missions until the 1990s. And they were not allowed in all combat missions until the 2010s. So this kind of launched that movement for women. And during World War II, more than 6 million women take wartime jobs in factories. Additionally, 3 million women volunteer for the Red Cross. And somewhere in the neighborhood of about 350,000 served in the armed forces. Now, what do I mean by they served in the armed forces? They were reservists for the most part. And we'll get into what they were in a little bit. But when the war ends, many women actually wanted to keep working these jobs. But most were laid off as men returned home needing jobs. Many of the men that left during the war were guaranteed their jobs when they came back. Wartime demand lowers, therefore we need a smaller workforce to begin with. And many women returned to traditional roles. The female workforce did increase post-war to 37% of the workforce, so it did go up by about 33%. Nearly 1 in 4 married women now work outside the home, which is up about 10-15%, but not huge gains. So, many industries in Madison County convert to wartime production, including but not limited to Oneida Limited, the Rex Watson Corporation, which is right over there, Westcott Keyless Chuck, the company of Master Craftsman, Oneida Heater, Keller Laboratories. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of Madison County men, somewhere around 4,000 people, served in some capacity meaning women who did not serve were needed specifically in our factories to help keep supplying the war effort. Oneida Limited specifically hired hundreds of women to supplement their missing workforce. Along with that, we see the founding of a number of programs that were restarted from World War I. The Women's Land Army typically brought women from urban settings who were capable of helping to prominent farm areas to provide assistance, typically during harvest time. 1943, 160 college-age young men and women were brought to Morrisville to help farmers bring in their crops, specifically beans and peas. So when you have a college like Morrisville, which is an agricultural school, they got double whacked. Number one, they lost young men to wartime, and number two, they lost young men going back to the farms to produce agricultural goods for the wartime. So they brought in people from New York City. These were students, so they would actually be brought in. They would work sun up to sundown. Farmers would come pick them up, take them. They would work. They'd be brought back at sundown. They would take classes after that. They'd go to sleep, start the day again. If the weather was too bad, they would have their classes during the day, and then they would have the rare evening to themselves. These people were trained in farming camps in Farmingdale, New York, and Bedford, New York. The women were referred to as farmerettes. They worked in groups of 6 to 8. They were paid equal wages as men in the program. They were college age. That presented a problem for some farmers. Any idea why? If you're a farmer's wife and 6 to 8 young college-age women are going to come work at your farm, are you going to be good with that? So there were wives that were not keen on having young, attractive women working on the farm. However, the women were expected to do all the chores that men were to do. Plow, milk cows, harvest fruits and vegetables, plant crops, prune trees, weeding, packing fruits and veggies, and working with livestock. The most prominent demand was here in the Northeast and in the Pacific West Coast. Along with opportunities for women to work, there was opportunities for them to learn new skills. So the Canastota director of the school industrial arts program actually started a program offering classes to learn how to make and repair furniture. Again, some of the stuff you couldn't get access to was supplies to make furniture. So if you had furniture that you could repair, or if you had scrap wood, you could take this class and teach you how to produce furniture. Additionally, across the country, first aid programs were offered to women, as well as classes that taught women about food production, crop growing, harvesting, and canning. That class specifically on the furniture taught women to make things like tables, desks, chairs, as well as learning how to repair and refurbish furniture you might find at a garage sale. Kind of fun. Keller Laboratories was actually Kelly Motors was an auto dealership. However, during the war, they struggled to find vehicles and tires. So Hugo Kreller was kind of an interesting guy. He was in a hospital, watching what was going on, and he watched how they would bandage somebody with plaster with a broken arm, and came up with an invention that actually would just administer strips that were already plastered. It was much faster, and started producing this, and did so well with it that he was able to hire an entire workforce. You can kind of see it's a bad picture, but his workforce was almost exclusively women. They were, at least according to one newspaper, the smallest company in the United States of America to receive an Army-Navy Award for excellence in production during the war. This is kind of a fun story. 1943, Ann Cunningham's husband, Leonard, who was a World War I veteran, joins the military service split just after their son, Howard, joins the Navy. Their other son, Donald, was a second lieutenant in the Air Transport Command, and their 2 daughters, Doris and Jeanette, were both in college. So Ann takes over both of the family businesses. She's operating a dairy and delivering milk, and she had a dynamite company. Yeah, Dynamite Dairy.
Don't mix those up.
That makes no sense?
Don't mix them up.
Especially when you're making deliveries.
Right.
So the dairy you can see here, that's actually her father working with her in the background. This is her actually delivering milk. She did the milk route while they were gone. And then the dynamite business was actually a dynamite delivery business. You had to have a license, however, and there were arrangements that had to be made. She had been the secretary and treasurer of the explosive supply company, so she had some familiarity with that. As I said, her father came in and helped her on the dairy. Their son Donald actually died while he was in service. The plane he was on crashed somewhere south of Iceland. Their daughter Jeanette was actually the first female of Oneida, female mayor of Oneida. She had a number of other things she did, kind of an interesting woman. But yeah, this is just one of those kind of random stories. Their grandson contacted me and said, "I think you'll like this story," and I did. So we see Oneida Limited, as I mentioned, their numbers go way up. You can see men and women on the payroll, we go from 1,927, 863, just prior to us getting into World War II, about a year. The following year, again, we have not been attacked in Pearl Harbor yet. Our numbers are still looking good. You see how much we lost. They lose 610 people to the armed services. That matches almost exactly the number of men. However, you see the women don't drop nearly as much, so they did keep a pretty strong workforce. We also see opportunities for women grow during Oneida Limited during World War II. They hired hundreds of women, and women worked in non-traditional departments such as the bayonet, bomb shackle, surgical tableware, knife departments. They were also, for the first time, elected to the Employee Council of Oneida Limited as department representatives, meaning that was like your kind of safety group, for lack of a better way to put it. This is the first time women are allowed to serve in that. They also edited the wartime newspaper, which is where this stuff comes from. Oneida Limited during the war published a newspaper called the Kenwood Chronicle, the Community Commando, excuse me. The Community Commando was one of the few unedited newspapers in the United States. However, most of their information came from the same place that the edited newspapers came from, so it's a little more, but not a ton. Women also became more active in the community organizations. They represented the boards, community organizations more. You actually see here on the Civer is one of the first women to be elected to the board of the Community Action Center, CAC in Sherrill. You see here, this is women that were editing the newspaper for this month. This is women working in the, I believe that's the bomb shackle unit. Nope, this is the bomb shackle unit. These women are working in the bayonet division. So you see women in, again, non-traditional roles. They're working in manufacturing, and not only working in manufacturing, but they're working in manufacturing in non-traditional roles within manufacturing. So when you look at the workforce before and after the war, we already kind of saw this. Iron and steel, we're less than 10%. During the war, women make up more than 20% of the workforce. War ends, 1946, drops down to 10. By 1950, we're back down to about 5. So in this scenario, they're actually lower than when they started. However, all the other ones, they're all slightly more. So there was growth after the war, but for the most part, it went pretty darn close back to equal. By 1945, 34% of women were working outside of their home, near 7% jump from 5 years before. That number amounted to over 16 million. Married women grew from 15 to 25, single women grew from 27 to 37%. Women now made over 1/4 of the workforce then. Today we're almost 50, 46.7%. 1945, about 33% of eligible women worked. Today, just under 60% of eligible women worked. And a funny unintended consequence of the war. The reason you can file taxes jointly is so many women worked, they determined they had to find a way to not have so many tax forms coming in. That was when we were allowed to file jointly starting in 1948. So women had opportunities in the service like they never had before, not only in the armed forces, but also in the Red Cross. Many positions were medical, teaching, or support roles. However, women did get opportunities to serve near combat. 432 women were killed in action, 88 women were taken prisoner. Just for some content or understanding, the Red Cross formed in 1881. By 1914, they had 107 chapters. In 1918, that went up to 3,864. World War I starts, we have more need. The organization shrinks following World War I, refocuses on disaster help as well as service to veterans, home care, and education before it reboots for the start of World War II. So we have every branch of the armed service opens some form of a women's division. It starts with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, or the AAAC WACs. They're formed in 1942. The original organization received no rank or benefits. However, in July of 1943, they were changed to the Women's Army Corps, became an official part of the U.S. Army, meaning women could serve overseas and be given benefits if they were killed in service. However, they were considered reservists. Women served in roles such as secretaries, cryptographers, photo interpreters, switchboard operators, typists, clerical positions, and more. The WACs, when it was converted to WAC, this was the first time African American women could serve, and that led to the setup of the 6,888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, which was an all-black female unit that served in Europe during World War. Their main purpose, any guesses? They were part of the Postal Division. So there's a huge backlog of stuff that needs to be shipped to soldiers. One of the ways we want to keep morale up is we want to keep those letters getting to them. If you've ever read a letter from World War II from a soldier, it almost always says, "Why haven't you written me lately?" So they actually were charged with getting this backlog out, and they did. They were considered an important role to keeping the men's morale up. The women accepted for volunteer emergency services, or WAVES. So I referenced quickly, during World War I, thousands of women served as yeomen. However, this program was discontinued. Yeomen were women who were required to have completed 4 years of high school. They would pass a physical examination, and almost all of them went into the Navy as a stenographer. However, their roles could include anything from bookkeeping, filing, typing, and payroll. Some would become radio and telephone operators, electricians, draftsmen. The women were enlisted just as the men were, doing many of the same jobs, receiving the same pay, following the same military regulations, wearing similar uniforms, and required to meet these standards in performance, and they received naval benefits. So this was the one time early on that women were allowed. However, it literally only lasted for about a year and a half. As soon as the war is over, the yeomen are out. We see the WAVES formed in 1942. Unlike the WACs, the WAVES were not allowed to serve overseas. They could only serve at coastal installations. They did serve at nearly 900 coastal installations during the war. In January of 1945, they were allowed to go to Alaska and Hawaii to serve. However, WAVES were not allowed to serve aboard ships. The bill that created the Marine Corps WAVES was not completed until they kind of got WAVES together in 1943. The WASPs, Women Air Force Service Pilots. 1942, women start flying for the U.S. Army Air Corps. 1943, there's two organizations that are combined to become the Women Air Force Service Pilots. These women's pilots, there was over 1,000 of them, become responsible for ferrying aircraft from factories to Air Force bases, to air bases, towing aerial targets for gunnery practice, and testing aircraft. So when you talk about not being in a dangerous situation, imagine somebody being taught how to use an anti-aircraft gun, and you have to fly the target that they're shooting at. And if they're not good at shooting, we now understand how 432 people may have died. The program was discontinued in December of 1944 due to a surplus of male pilots and pressure to put them to work. WASP pilots flew over 12,000 aircraft. They did occasionally fly them to overseas theaters. Two WASPs you can read about pretty regularly. Dorothea Johnson and Dora Doherty Strother were two of the earliest pilots to test the B-29 Superfortress after a number of male pilots refused due to its size. The smallest of the women's unit was organized in 1942 and only recruited through 1944. That was Semper Paratus, Always Ready, Coast Guard, or the SPARS. The name comes from the Coast Guard motto. The director of the SPARS program was a woman named Dorothy Stratton, who was brought over from the WAVES program. It was a very short-lived program, and it didn't seem to get off the ground before the war was over, but they did exist. The American Red Cross serves both overseas and at home. The organization was activated in 1939 to assist the war effort, and then following the attack on Pearl Harbor, they become more active. At the peak of the war in 1945, the Red Cross had 7.5 million volunteers and 39,000 paid staff. Their organization goals were put into 4 categories: service to the armed forces, volunteer special services, specialized wartime services, war-related aspects of ongoing Red Cross service. The Red Cross comprised of the military naval warfare service, the home service, the camp and hospital service, and near the end of the war, they worked in veterans hospitals. A group of domestic programs were carried on by volunteers through local Red Cross chapters. Again, shameless plug. We talk about all the stuff the Red Cross did during the wars in this book right here. They also did things such as blood donor programs, prisoner of war relief, civil defense, foreign aid to Civil War volunteers. One of the big things was, if you've ever read a prisoner of war journal, they sent care packages, for lack of a better way to put it, food to soldiers that were being held prisoner, including nursing and they also did trainings, including nursing, first aid, water safety, junior Red Cross, and college Red Cross units. They enrolled 104 nurses for service, prepared 27 million packages for POWs, and initiated a blood program that collected 13.3 million pints of blood. So we also see women start to get some specialized roles during the war. Most of the women served in traditional roles, but they were trained in roles typically filled by men as well. They were trained in mechanics, both vehicle and air shaft, paratroop riggers, air traffic controllers, and vehicle drivers. Some even became specialized in military roles such as aerial gunnery, and others were given roles that required top secret clearance. So we'll talk about some of the women that actually served from Madison County and what they did, kind of as our last part here. So we start with the first set of twins to serve in the WACs, who are actually from Canastota. Arlene and Pauline Kenter were the first twins to join WACs in October of 1943. Both women were working for the company of master craftsmen in Oneida when they joined. Pauline becomes a private first class, serving as a typist in the quartermaster corps, serving overseas in New Guinea. Arlene serves as a private, becomes a dental assistant in the service. Both women were honorably discharged and returned home following the war. Both women got married, lived locally. Pauline died in 1992, Arlene in 2016. Cecilia Anderson was born in California in 1900. She moved to Earlville in 1917. She graduates from high school the following year, goes to normal school, attends Syracuse University, graduates in 1928. She works as a teacher in the city of Syracuse. She enlists in the WAC program in 1944 and is assigned to the Army Medical Corps, where she conducts classes for wounded soldiers on world history, war progress, and historical, economical, and geographic backgrounds of Allied countries. That seems like they're kind of telling them what to think right there. Following the war, she returned to teaching before retiring in 1969. After nearly 50 years of teaching, she dies in 1952, and she's buried in Syracuse. Mary Walsh was born in Casanova. She attends the Potsdam School of Music, was a popular piano player. Following her graduation, she had a professional singing career with a group called the Three Reasons, who performed with Forrest Height, Tommy Dorsey. She joins the WACs in 1942, serves in Brisbane, Australia, Manila, obtains the rank of captain, was a commanding officer of all WACs in Australia before she was discharged in 1946. The same year, she married William Oakey. She moved to California and had a long singing career there. She died in 1991. Betty Ann Lanigan was born in 1922 in Rome. She graduated from Rome Free Academy in 1939, Potsdam State College in 1944. Following her graduation, she moves to Long Island. She teaches until 1945 when she moved to Hamilton, and she joins the American Red Cross. She served in the Philippines for a year. She returns to the U.S., works across the country as a musician and a reporter, and in 1952 she took a position with NBC and started a career of 29 years, initially working with Bob Hope, and she took 6 trips with him to Vietnam to entertain the troops. She returned to Rome in 1987. Now mind you, at that point in time, she is 65 years old and decides to get her master's degree from Old Dominion College. She teaches at Mohawk Valley Community College until 1999. So she lived a really interesting life. There's lots of stuff written about her. She was kind of fun. This is probably the saddest of the stories. Susan Petrie was born in Peterborough in 1905. She graduates from Canastota schools. 1924, goes to nursing school, graduating in 1927. She moves to New York City briefly, works as a private nurse, returns home in 1931. She served as a school nurse for Canastota for 12 years before enrolling as a Red Cross reserve. Shortly after that, she receives a commission, joins the U.S. Army Nurses Corps in 1943, serves as a nurse on troop trains during the war. Following the war, she works at the Batavia Veterans Hospital, the Syracuse Veterans Hospital. In 1957, she marries Adlai Wheel. 2 years later, she took her own life. A few years earlier, it's referenced that her husband stated she had a nervous upsetness. The best I can tell, she probably suffered from some sort of PTSD because she spent most of her life working with soldiers that were struggling with their return home from war. July of 1943, she's stationed at Pine Camp in Halloran General Hospital in Staten Island. She moves to Rhodes Island in Utica. She's then transferred to Denver, Colorado. She comes back home, works 6 years for the Batavia Veterans Hospital, and then moves to the Veterans Hospital in Syracuse. Reba Maury Dugan was born in Earlville in 1921. She graduates from a local school, was working at the Earlville Paper Box Company prior to enlisting in the Waves in 1944. She joins as an apprentice seaman and left in November of 1945. Seaman second class. She was trained in the Bronx and Milledgeville, Georgia. She was assigned to the Naval Supply Depot in Mechanicsburg, where she figured and typed orders for the ships, stores, as well as correspondence. She was honorably discharged, married Francis Dugan in Pennsylvania. They had at least one daughter that we're aware of, Deanna, and she died in the Oxford Veterans Home in 2013. Margaret Cady was born in Canastota, March of 1912. Upon graduating from Canastota High School, she enrolls at Cortland Normal School, earns a teaching degree. She was an elementary school teacher for 5 years before enlisting in the WACs. August of 1943, she served in the Signal Corps in the Pacific Theater, including stops in Australia, New Guinea, and the island of Luzon, the Philippines. Following the war, she returned home and taught in the Westmoreland schools for 17 years before retirement. She is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. She was also very active in the Red Cross. Anella French was born in Oneida in December of 1916. Upon graduating at the age of 16, her parents told her she could not go to Oberlin College, where she had a music scholarship, because she was too young. So instead, she enrolled at Faxton School of Nursing, graduating in 1941. She joined the Army in 1942, was commissioned as a second lieutenant, served in the invasions of North Africa, Italy, and Sicily, and I'm going to butcher this, but Pantel area, where the 34th Station Hospital was set up. That hospital was the first hospital that was attached directly to an Army unit in World War II. She returned home, got married, and had a daughter. That is her. That is the second woman to set foot on North Africa. And our final person we're going to talk about is Mabel Berry Vincent. Mabel Berry Vincent was born in Syracuse but grew up in Shenango. Her family lived here until 9th grade when they moved. Her father had a pretty good job during the Depression. He bought a milk route and they had a good life. They decided to move to Houston. They only last 1 year before they come back to Shenango. But she decides that she's going to go to school in Syracuse, which she does. Her brothers were both pilots, and they wrote her a letter saying, hey, you know, they're going to get lady pilots soon. You ought to learn to fly. And she did. And following the war, she married Lester Smith, had 4 children. They moved to Indiana, later Florida. She was one of the female WASPs that received a Congressional Gold Medal in 2010. But this is the lady pilot that I referenced the guy talked about. And what's interesting about her is she did an hour-long interview before she died. She died in 2014, talking about what her experiences were like with Grand Valley State University. And Grand Valley State University was nice enough to let me utilize this video, so I chopped it down into about 5 2-minute segments each, roughly. And we're going to start with what it was like to get to Canastota to fly.
Well, all I did was learn to fly, and I soloed after 8 hours of dual. And then I moved to a little airport down in Canastota, New York, after I soloed, which was only 8 miles east of Chittenango. And that way I could stand in front of my house and hitchhike down to that little airport. And I did that every time I was going to fly. Pretty soon, and I had a new instructor, and I got off, I'd hitchhike and get a ride, and the people would let me off, and then I'd walk a half a mile up to the airport and then fly. And then when I had 20 hours of solo and dual combined, my instructor said, I just got a job testing radar by flying over their factory, GE factory, for 3 hours at a time. He said, I'll give you that job and you will get the free flying time, and he would get the money for it, so that worked out perfect. That way I could hitchhike to Canastota Airport, walk the half a mile, fly to Syracuse, New York, which was 30 or 40 miles away, find a factory, and there were hundreds of factories. I don't know how I found it, but I did. And then fly 3 hours back and forth, testing radar, whatever that was. And then fly back to Canastota, walk back to the highway and hitchhike home. That was my life on weekends.
So she's going to talk about the WASP program now.
Why do you think there was such a need for women to fly? Well, there would fly in the back seat, and the hood, she had a hood that she could pull up over the canopy, which she couldn't see out. She had to fly by instruments.
And I read that there was primary, basic, and advanced training. What did that consist of?
Well, the primary was flying steerman. Remember, we already had 35 hours of flying time, and lots of the girls had a lot more than that. But, they were teaching us how to fly steerman, and that was open. And our only training for parachutes were, in the open plane, they said, if your engine quits, then you can unbuckle your seatbelt, stand up. If the wind doesn't take you out, jump over the side and pull your ripcord. That was our training for
How about the basic and advanced?
advanced. Let's see, that was primary, basic. After we flew the steerman, we flew the AT-6s. We jumped from a small plane to a pretty big one. And they said, if you can fly an AT-6, you can fly any fighter the Air Force has. So we flew that for about 70 hours. Because we flew solo and dual, long and short cross-country trips, day and night, solo and dual. Same exactly as the men.
She talked about her first assignments.
So where did you go for your first assignment?
Waco, Texas, Blackland Army Air Force Base. That was a base for hundreds of cadets who were learning to fly the AT-10, which was a twin-engine advanced trainer. And those cadets were learning to fly that, and then they would go on to four-engine or twin-engine bombers, and then go into combat.
Do you think you were ready when you walked in there?
And when I reported for duty at number 1 hangar, there are 4 hangars in Fort West there. And when I reported for duty, I said, sir, I'm reporting for duty as your new test pilot. And he said, Jesus Christ. And I said, no, very Vincent. And no woman had ever been in that hangar before, and they didn't tell him I was coming, and he was in total shock. But right away, he got a twin-engine airplane, an instructor, and a parachute for me, and we went up, and he gave me 3 hours of dual, and he said, I've taught you all I know about this airplane. You are a test pilot now. So the next morning, I came down to work at the hangar, and there were 8 AT-10s to be tested, and I tested them perfectly.
And so I didn't play it with this, but when she says testing, there was something wrong with the plane that the mechanics thought they fixed. So she would fly around, and if they didn't fix it, she would land quickly. And if they did fix it, it was ready to be transported somewhere else. This is her end of service.
The day before we were to be disbanded on the 19th of December, the commanding officer came to me, and he said, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd been testing AT-10s all day. He said, I want you to fly as a sergeant to Columbus, Ohio, right now at 3 o'clock. And so I said, yes, sir. And we got a parachute for him, and I ran to my barracks and got my toothbrush because I knew I'd have to stay overnight. So we flew to Memphis, Tennessee, and I got fuel. And then we got up to Columbus, Ohio, maybe 9, 10 at night, and there were about 10 four-engine bombers, B-17s in the traffic pattern. But I worked my way in and landed and stayed in the BOP
So after the war, they were all offered the great opportunity of being flight attendants for either Delta or American Airlines, I don't remember which, but she never flew a plane again. As I said, she got married, she moved to Indianapolis, she moved to Texas, or to Florida. Her full interview was online, you can just Google her name. Great Valley State did a great job. She is very funny. She died in 2014, unfortunately. She's very funny in the interview, and she tells great stories. You can also find her if you look on YouTube. She's in a lot of compilations. And with that, I'll ask if there's any questions, comments, or rude remarks. Thank you for coming. If you want to pick up a copy of the book, I appreciate it. And if not, drive safe. Better that you're here tonight than last night.
Yeah.